Hello. I love that there's like this appetite for early morning drug pricing conversations. Makes me happy about this country. Okay, so let's get right to it because I have a lot of questions and I'm sure you all will have a lot of questions. We're going to open up the floor for some audience Q&A. I'll give you a heads up, but think in the back of your minds about the questions you want to ask this esteemed panel. Susan, let's start first with a sort of newsy angle on this subject, which is the uproar over Sovaldi's pricing. Gilead has justified charging more than $1,000 a dose for its hepatitis C medication, arguing that it would be more expensive for patients to treat Hep C on an ongoing basis. Is this fair?
Fair, right? That's the question. Is the argument legitimate that there are offsets to drug consumption? Of course. If drugs work, if taken as prescribed, if they result in the outcomes desired, then you will see people be healthier and they will probably need less health care. You get into all kinds of complexities over what is the timeline along which you recoup that investment. And that was where a lot of the argument was around the Hep C drugs. I think everyone agrees those drugs are important cures. Everybody agrees we should get those drugs to the right patient at the right time. The question is really at what price, and is it in effect affordable, not just for an individual patient, but for society? That is really the question around drug pricing.
Alan, where does it leave patients?
I think it's a challenge for patients. Obviously, you have, I think, as we were talking about before we came in, the reality of the U.S. healthcare system is there's a certain group of patients. I guess I should preface my comments by saying the type of patients we work are predominantly low income with an average household income of $23,000 a year, household size of 2, which puts them pretty well under 200% of the federal poverty level, which if you know sort of public health data around at what benchmark most patients need some form of subsidized assistance, it starts at about 400% of FPL, thus the threshold for subsidies in the marketplace exchange plans. So sort of setting that out there as a preface, I think in the U.S. healthcare system, it's all very expensive, whether it's drug prices, whether it's a couple days in the hospital, whether it's surgery, whether it's radiology. There's a certain group of haves and have-nots in this country if you're going to run a healthcare system based on sort of a semi-private marketplace, right? So there's going to be a group of patients who are sitting there at that 400% or lower of the federal poverty level who aren't going to be able to afford the U.S. healthcare system, and you're never going to be able to bring drug prices down far enough. So that group of patients, there is, the higher the price is, whether it's a drug or whether it's surgery or whatever, without some sort of subsidized assistance, they're not going to be able, even if they have insurance, they're not going to be able to access the system unless we have a safety net that's in place to try to help fill that gap between what they can afford, even with insurance, and what the U.S. healthcare system costs writ large. And insurance, for most patients, actually plays a pretty important role in protecting them from the actual cost. So middleman just released a cost of cancer care study that followed breast cancer, lung cancer, and colorectal cancer patients over 4 years using actual market scan data. So this is in the employer-insured market. And it turns out the average cost to the system, so to speak, of those 3 diseases, in terms of the total cost, ranges from about $110,000 to about $300,000 over a period of 4 years. The out-of-pocket exposure for the patient, and what's encompassed in their benefit design, ranged only from about $6,000 to about $14,000. So there's a huge gap between what the plans pay for and what the system pays for and what patients are exposed to. And that's the purpose of insurance, is to protect patients from that gap between what you might call the price and what patients out-of-pocket exposure to. But that $14,000 there's a big difference between what that out-of-pocket burden is to you as a patient if you're making $28,000 a year versus $160,000 a year. And I don't mean to suggest that patients that make that kind of income aren't suffering financially. They do, and oftentimes they're not eligible when they need it.
Right.
They're not eligible for the income testing.
But still, if you're proportionally talking about a share of income.
It's regressive. The pricing is regressive because you're going to pay the same 20% on your hospital bill or your drug copay if it's a specialty tier, or 40% or whatever it is, whether you make $100,000 or you make $20,000. So I think that just puts another burden and challenge on the system. The more expensive the healthcare system gets, the harder it is for the population that is low income. Their ability to afford it and even use their insurance that they have becomes either further out of reach without some sort of subsidized support, whether it's Medicaid expansion, which we know that's not really happening very well, whether it's the low
Well, we don't really know what's happening with that, right? But to get back to the sort of patient perspective, Tonya, so Peter Bach at MSK Memorial Sloan Kettering, his research shows that the premiums pharmaceutical companies earn from charging substantially higher prices for their medications in the United States compared to other Western countries generate substantially more than the companies spend globally on research and development. So are patients not correct in thinking they are paying too much for their medications, life-saving or not, here in the United States?
Well, I think it's all about, who defines value. And in the eyes of a patient, value and the worth is sometimes quite different than that in the eyes of the industry, manufacturer, certainly in the eyes of the payer. Value is subjective. And what something is worth to you is subjective. And so I think that patients' perception is, yes, we're paying too much for our medication. We're paying too much for our health insurance premiums. Again, more than 30% of working Americans are now on high deductible health plans and are being subjected to those list prices of products. So of course they're frustrated. They're paying more in premiums. They feel as if they're getting fewer benefits. And in fact, they're paying more out of pocket for their healthcare cost each and every day, whether that's in their pharmaceuticals, in their hospital stays. More of that burden is being bared by patients.
Well, let's talk about what value means, okay? Because there are a lot of variables when it comes to drugs, Susan. When you talk about whether a drug works or not, I mean, how do you define that in terms of value? Given the fact that some drugs may work over the long term, some may be short term, some drugs may get you to a place where you can get more costly treatment, ultimately, that could save your life, but won't be less expensive in the long run. So let's talk a little bit about working.
Well, I think what we have to do is start with what is in the drug label, right? Because in effect, drugs get approved for specific indications and based on clinical trial results. And so that would be the narrow definition of working, right? Does the drug perform as it did in the clinical trial? Right. Now we know the whole world of real world evidence suggests that sometimes the answer is yes and sometimes the answer is no, right? So it's a more complicated question than to say simply if everybody's going to achieve the results.
Do you think that performance in clinical trial should be a sort of bedrock part of how we value a drug?
Well, that's what we have to agree on, right? Because that's the basis on which we approve drugs and let them onto the market. So I think we have to start there as a definition of working. But I mean, to come back to another point here, which is about the prices and U.S. patients. As Alan said, keep in mind, we pay more for everything in our healthcare system than the rest of the world does. We pay higher hospital prices, we pay more for our doctors. Everything is at a much higher price level than the rest of the world. The difference with drugs is, if we pay higher prices for our hospitals, the rest of the world doesn't benefit from that. When we invest a lot of money in drugs, the rest of the world benefits from that investment. So an important question in this whole dynamic is, are U.S. patients in effect
subsidizing research and development?
In effect, are we as a country basically footing a lot of the bill for investment in drugs that go on to benefit much of the rest of the world? And the answer is yes, that is what's happening.
So would you say that innovation is at odds with affordability?
No, I don't think we could ever say that, because we get other things out of, as we just said, there are these offsets. And those offsets that we're talking about are just in the healthcare system. If you're cured of hepatitis C, it is true over time, if you were going to be eligible for a liver transplant, you would not need a liver transplant. That is a form of savings. But much more broadly, if people are healthier, they're more productive, and we all benefit from that as a society. So I don't think we can say that those two things are at odds.
I want to get in here.
I think it's important from an economics perspective. There's just making something cheaper and making it more cost effective. And I think that's the premium we're paying for in the U.S. healthcare system, is we're putting a real premium on innovation. And we're obsessed with technology in this country. And the world is too, but not the way we are. So we're a very consumer-driven society. We love our innovation. We always want the next best thing, and we have to pay for it. That's the struggle. And the alternative is, and the difference is between all those other countries in the U.S. is what? Those are all government-run healthcare systems.
Yeah.
We are not. So that's really the differentiator.
Or at least
behind
the
your
pricing
question.
is government
To some
directed
extent, yeah.
to some degree.
But I think you can be more cost-effective in the innovation. I think that's where the value-based pricing comes in, not just for drugs, but across the system. And as the first panel alluded to, that's the purpose. Some of that was in ACA, and obviously macro was sort of the whole push to reform the system away from volume and over to value. But I think you can be more cost-effective in the way that if personalized medicine, and I may be jumping ahead in your questions, but if personalized medicine is the goal of trying to marry up the right treatment for the right patient at the right time, then if that's truly where we're going, where the science is heading, then we have to marry up how that payment goes against that too. So if you had a product that was expensive, but it was only given to the patients for whom that product was going to have the most efficacy and the most impact, then it would be more effective, right? So you're not giving it to, you're not wasting that. The opportunity cost is lowered because you're not using that drug inappropriately or taking a risk with using it in patients to whom they're not going to respond and using it in those patients that are. So you avoid the cost of first and second line therapies that aren't successful.
Right.
So in the end of but you have to expand your time horizon over which you look at the value proposition of those products, which is a challenge because we're a quarterly, whether it's the insurance company, whether it's and whether it's the drug companies, whether it's the PBMs, they're all sort of driven by this quarterly, and I'm not criticizing that, that's just what we've accepted in the U.S. healthcare market. They're driven by quarterly profit earnings. So you have to accept some of that, what comes with that, if that's how we're going to pursue our healthcare system.
Do patients understand how to navigate this landscape?
In most cases, absolutely not. I think the system is so very complex. And we talk to hundreds of patients each and every week at Allergy and Asthma Network. And they don't understand. They don't understand why drug prices continue to go up, why their premiums continue to go up, why their hospital costs continue to go up, and they're confused. Again, you listen to the media reports and you hear the list price of drugs that last year, if you were on a copay plan, you were paying $20 out of pocket.
Right.
This year, you've switched to a high deductible plan and you're paying $600. How can that possibly be? Patients, again, were never intended to pay that list price. And we understand that. We're trying to educate the public around that. And yet, the complexity of the system, all of the middlemen, is just overwhelming for patients. And they turn a deaf ear because it's just too complicated.
Right. You mentioned middlemen. So drug manufacturers retain only about 63% of the drug's list price after negotiations with the PBMs, rebates, et cetera. The middlemen play a critical role here, and yet public awareness about that is basically non-existent, would you say?
Absolutely. I mean, when you look at Fortune 500's top list of companies here in the U.S., 3 of the PBMs are in the top 20. How can that be? I mean, we don't know those names. As general Americans who are out buying our medications and seeing our physicians, trying to take care of our health, we don't know those names. We don't know what value they add to the chain, and we certainly don't realize that they get over 30% of every dollar.
Susan, your thoughts on middlemen?
Well, as we know,
Wow.
our whole system, our capitalist system, is riddled with middlemen, right?
Right.
And a lot of savings in various industries come about when you cut out the middlemen. One of the big innovations Walmart brought to the market for generics was essentially cutting out the middlemen by buying en masse, and therefore it was able to bring generics to market for a $4 a charge, which was below $1 below the typical $5 copay that people had at the time. So could we do things, if the question is, could we do things in the system to lessen the take that the middlemen have? Of course we could do that. It would be a question of exerting some pressure, some market pressure in the system to do that. That's one area where I think some of the innovations coming about now in value-based contracting could get us down that road, because these are direct contracts struck between payers and manufacturers. And in effect, the role of the middleman becomes less if there's a direct contract struck between these two parties.
And that's sort of the question about how value-based pricing fits into the broader healthcare landscape, which is moving away from paying for volume and moving towards prioritizing value, right, Alan?
Yeah.
So how do you see this being of a piece with that?
Well, so I think what's happening, and I'm not a pharmacoeconomist, so I can only speculate based on what I've read and just sort of using common sense. I am trained as a political economist, which is the worst kind of economist, just so you know. But if precision medicine is driving discovery, and it's not just in drugs, right? It's in other areas of medicine too. But it really means that you have a smaller and smaller population that you're serving with that product. And what we know just based on basic microeconomics, the smaller the market for a particular product, especially when you have fixed costs for the R&D and the development to get, and the clinical trial process or whatever the approval process is to get that to market, that if your population that you can serve with that product is smaller and smaller, everything is starting to become like what we see in the rare disease market, where everything is expensive. But I think the trick, though, is to make that more affordable and this is the benefit of precision medicine, that same product that might work in a small subset of the breast cancer population may also work in a small set of the MS population, because it's driven by some sort of genomic marker, some characteristic of the genetic composition of the drug that may be true in other disease areas. And that gets you from a product that's serving 5,000 patients up to 25 or 300, up to sort of that blockbuster status of $200,000 or $300,000 or $400,000. That's where the price is going to start to come down. So we just don't have a system that's designed to really accommodate that type of approach to medicine. So I don't want to be too bleak, but of course that's, economics is the dismal science, so you have to be bleak about everything. But I think the point is, though, with precision medicine, to marry those two things up, you have to really, you have to marry up what's the best, most appropriate treatment for a particular patient based on their unique characteristics and preferences, and then put that at risk, right? And that's the whole idea behind bundled payment and population-based payments, is that you're putting some risk into making sure that you've done that properly. And if it works, you should be rewarded for it, right? And that's true of the medical, that's the whole idea behind value-based pricing across the system, not just in drug pricing or in, say, a bundled payment around the treatment for breast cancer surgery or, maternity care, those types of bundled payment designs. The idea is that if you provide the right care and you get better outcomes, you get more rewarded. So that sort of incentivizes you to make sure that you find what is the right care for that patient and deliver it to them. If you don't, you're going to lose, in a double-sided model, you're going to lose some money by choosing wrongly, right? So that's the idea of value-based pricing. It maximizes the incentive to try to make sure that you're not wasting time and effort giving people products that aren't going to work. But that's not how our system was designed.
Yeah.
And to your point earlier about patients, can they navigate the system? This system was never designed for patients to navigate it. Not at all. It was designed for patients to sit there and be told what to do. And now we're changing that completely, which is great. We should change that. But now you're ripping the Band-Aid off and you're exposing it to more and more information, more and more transparency around cost. But the system's not really designed to do that.
I don't know, we could say that the system was designed. I think the system just
Right,
happened.
That might be even generous.
Right,
to
it's
say.
sort of Rube Goldberg, What should
Brownian
what should the system be doing to better enfranchise patients at this particular moment, Tonya?
Well, I think that, again, we've seen some of the reform that certainly helps to ensure that the right patient gets the right treatment at the right time. Certainly, we need certain policies that accelerate innovation to the market. But we also need policy that protect the most vulnerable in our society. We need to be sure that patients are able to access the care that they need at the time that they need it. It's heartbreaking to talk with families who literally are making the choice between food on their table or their child's asthma inhaler. That should not be the case. And so I think that we have to continue to push the envelope on accessibility and affordability. And we have to look at ways to continue to refine the system to make sure that we can get the care that we need.
How hopeful are you that we're moving in that direction, given I'll just be euphemistic and say confusion around health insurance at this moment in time?
I think it's challenging. I don't think there are easy answers. I think if there were easy answers, we would have already solved it.
Susan, are the stakeholders at least cooperating with each other in this picture?
I think if we go back to the area of value-based contracting, where you have a payer and a manufacturer, getting together to talk about their common goals. What are their common goals? Payers, notwithstanding popular belief, payers really do want to get the right cures, right drugs to the right patient at the right time, right? So they have an interest in doing that. That is their job, that, as they see it. Manufacturers obviously are making these products to benefit people, right? So the question is, what construct can you put around that ensures that you get the right drug to the right patient at the right time at a price that those two can agree on and under other arrangements that they can agree on? So when you have a system where the manufacturer, by nature of the contract, is incentivized to make sure that the right patients, and only the right patients, get the drug, that they are adherent to the drug, so they take extra steps to do that, that they do a lot of monitoring. A lot of these contracts are built on heavy aggregation and monitoring of data. And then you agree, if all these terms are met, certain prices are met, or discounts, or rebates exchange hands, or what have you. I mean, that is movement toward a greater element of sanity than we have in the market currently. Now, these contracts are complicated. It is hard to imagine that with 45 new active substances coming online every year, we're going to be able to get contracts around all of these. So it's not a panacea. And it obviously doesn't help with many other aspects of drug pricing that people are concerned about. For example, generic drugs that don't have competitor products that prices get raised around. So again, not a panacea, doesn't fix everything. Is it movement in the right direction? Yes.
Well, to that end, though, you mentioned data and monitoring. Is there enough administrative support at present to do this right? I mean, it's a much bigger infrastructure that's necessitated here in value-based pricing.
Well, it takes heavy investment. Now, as a country, we've made some very serious investments over the past decade in electronic health records.
Yeah.
And we've got ability now to extract lots of data. We have to work on the interoperability piece of EHRs. But we were collecting a lot of clinical data in a digitized form. So it is more possible now to garner the kind of data that we would need to see to ensure that outcomes are being met. Does that make it easy? No. It's a big investment to undertake even that degree of monitoring. Go ahead,
I think if you think about getting to the data monitoring point, and this is a point made on the first panel, is that there's only so much you can learn from the clinical trial process, right? So a lot of what, especially in this precision medicine environment, where there may be some things you don't know about the mechanism of action of the product, how it may work in other disease areas. So there's a lot that needs to be rethought and is happening right now in the clinical trial market. But then there's that same sort of thinking and redesign needs to happen sort of in the post-market environment too. So we need to be better tracking and setting up a system for patient-reported outcomes and real-world evidence that will help us understand what the variation is in different product benefits. And that's what you want to incentivize, right? So you want to try to figure out what is the variable in benefit to different patients based on different characteristics. And then you pay according to how much benefit is being derived for that patient, how well you're hitting the mark against matching up the right treatment. And again, it doesn't work if you just do this in one piece, like if you just do it for surgery, but not for other things. You really have to apply the same approach to how you price things and incentivize things across the system. So if you're going to do it one place, you have to do it in all. But I think it's not, I can envision a world that is not too expensive to collect the data if you put it in the hands of the patients and let them deliver the data so that you don't have the providers doing the chart extractions and doing all the data warehousing and the data collection, because that's very expensive to have someone who makes that, who costs that much to be sitting down at their computer and doing data crunching or paying people to do lots of data entry is a very expensive proposition for the system. Now, you get better data, that's true. So we have to sort of figure out how, robustness versus, real world data, there's an issue there. But I think that is the cheaper path, is having the data, at least to some extent, about how well a treatment paradigm is doing for a particular patient has to come in some part from the patient's own experience. And I'm not talking about the hospitality set of things, like how nicely were you treated at the reception desk. That's important to patients. And how much free parking you got. Those are important things. I don't want to minimize them. But also the treatment benefit, right? And how do patients assess that, as well as the side effects. What side effects did that patient experience and when, and how were those managed? So when you start to collect those types of data and then you pay, you incentivize the system to reward when you when you meet patients' expectations better and make sure you're giving them the right treatment that matches up with the variable benefit that you'd expect from different treatments. That's going to be a more cost-effective. I don't know that it's necessarily going to make it cheaper, but at least it'll be more cost-effective. So we'll get better value. Doesn't mean it's going to be cheaper. It just means it should be, you'll get a better value.
That's a sort of banner headline from
Right.
this. Right. Value doesn't necessarily mean cheaper.
If you want cheaper, you got to go government. I mean, there's a solution there that
Although
we've been skirting around.
The American public thinks that value
means cheaper.
Right, yeah.
We've been trained to think that value means cheaper, and that is another behavior that may need to be changed. On that note, I want to go to our audience. We have just a couple minutes for questions. If you want to raise your hand, we have mics traveling in the audience. Just let us know who you are. Okay, right up here.
John Rother with the National Coalition on Healthcare. Excellent discussion, but I want to raise some inconvenient facts. Number one, the concept of value implies a steady price, but the industry practice is to raise prices on a regular basis every year with no discernible change in value. So that seems inconsistent. Number two, I think it's true that the value to each individual patient would vary, and that implies that a price might vary. That's going to be very difficult not to have a standard price. Number three, many drugs do not cure. They simply extend, in some cases extend suffering, and that's difficult to measure what value means. And then many more, but last one here, I challenge the idea that we are paying for innovation for the rest of the world. Really what we're paying for is marketing, which is much more expensive in the US than research and development, and the rest of the world does not permit that kind of expenditure. So when we pay a very exorbitant price for drugs, we're really paying for marketing costs, not R&D.
Susan, let's start with the last piece, because I think there are a lot of variables when you talk about value. The R&D, the innovation versus affordability question that's being brought up here. I mean, and the stats from MSK, we in the U.S. are paying more to these drug companies than other Western countries, and that amount is substantially more than what they're spending on R&D. So that money is going somewhere else.
Right.
Where does marketing fit in here?
And I deeply respect my dear friend John Rother here. I will say, companies do spend on R&D, and they do spend on marketing, right? And we know we are paying the highest prices. So we're subsidizing both, right? Now you can argue, would we be happier if we were paying less for marketing? That's a fair argument to have. But we know we are paying for R&D, right? It's just ipso facto. So, but I guess the question that we always have to come back to is, what's the alternative, right? What's the alternative? Do we want to go to a more regulated pricing regime, as many other countries have done? We could do that as a nation. We could have a system of reference pricing, which most of the European countries have. Do we understand fully what the impact of that would be? No, we don't know what the impact of that would be. Is it at least theoretically possible that the impact would be that there would be less innovation? Of course it's theoretically possible, right? So this is the question that we face, and I don't think anybody has the answers.
Yeah, and just to respond to one of your other points, John, I think you hit the nail on the head for several of the big challenges to shifting to this idea of paying for value. I think it's the right approach, but again, it's a long way to go to get there, and we haven't set up we're using old technology in a lot of ways to try, and now we're trying to sort of lay a new payment model incentive on top of it. But I think to your point about having set prices, I think that is sort of the payment design model, is that you would get a certain amount to manage, just like what the insurance companies have to deal with now. You have a set budget to use to manage against an entire population. Now the individual pricing in a value-based model, you would get a set, at least in some of them, there's all sorts of different constructs, but at least in some of them, you would get a set price to manage a certain group of population based on some criteria. And then for each individual patient, what you pay and how you allocate against that budget would vary based on so it would allow you to vary what you spend on patients, but still have sort of a standard price, if you will, for what you're getting paid to manage that entire population. So there are some ways to get around that, but that is one of the big challenges, is how do you there's a reason fee-for-service has been around for a long time. Transactionally, it's an easy method to try to figure out what you owe and to pay. it's not it doesn't incentivize the right thing, because what you want to pay for is outcomes and value.
Right.
But that's a challenging thing to get at, because value truly is, you can either define it and say this is value for every breast cancer patient and sort of set a benchmark, or the reality is value is going to vary from patient to patient. How much pain and suffering they're willing to handle, what their treatment benefit is that they want, is going to vary. So inherently, the idea of value is going to be sort of like beauty. It's in the eye of the beholder.
It's
Yes.
elastic.
Yeah.
Value is elastic. Okay, one more question back here.
Oh, hi. Thank you. My name is Frederick Stein. I'm with the AACOM. I'm a fourth-year medical student who's about to start a residency in pediatrics, and so this is really important to me, because if I know what the right drugs are for my patients, but my patients can't afford those drugs, that turns into a major treatment issue. And I kind of wanted to get a little bit more to what Alan was talking about, and it's kind of a twofold question. One, how do we ensure that value is patient-centered, that we're actually empowering the patient to define what value is, since you said value is in the eye of the beholder? And while we're tinkering with all of this and trying to figure out the right thing, and the government's trying to figure it out too, how do we protect the patient? Because when it all comes down to it, that's the person we're working for.
Let me start with you, Tonya, and then we'll make our way down, and we have to be succinct,
very
my
succinct,
friends.
Yes. So, I think first and foremost, it's around awareness and education. We, as patients, we must be more actively engaged in understanding our health care and understanding how we can access care, certainly connecting with patient support groups and with advocacy organizations, with manufacturers that have programs. Patients care about minimizing out-of-pocket expense. That's what's most important to patients. So for you as a provider to ensure that your patients are connected and supported in that way is critically important, and to ensure that they get the care they need.
Alan?
Yeah, so to your first question, how do you ensure patient-centeredness? I think that really gets to the idea of making sure that every treatment decision and every care decision starts with a conversation about what matters to patients, and so that you understand what is their preference sensitivity around key dimensions, cost, side effects, and benefits. And then you can use sort of decision support tools and other evidence-based tools to try to marry up, all right, what are the available options to you based on what you've told me are your preferences, and what is the evidence support? But this is where value-based pricing can come in, right? So I've got and precision medicine will suggest there's probably going to be a range of options that may deal with certain preferences better than others. And you have to make a choice about what it is that you're going to, where do you think you're going to get the maximum benefit for that patient based on what they've told you is important to them. And then you put money at risk to achieve those goals on the part of the patient. The system's already putting practices and providers and hospitals at risk, right? In these value-based models, everybody needs to be put at that same kind of risk. Now, whether it's one-sided or two-sided and all that is a whole convoluted, you said brevity, which is why you went to her first and me second. So I'll stop there, but that's the question of the day, really, is how do you make this work for patients so that it's the value proposition is, because healthcare is so personal to the individual. When you're sitting down in front of your physician or your nurse practitioner or your PA and you're talking about your cancer, it is your cancer. It is so personal to you. So to think about that there's some standard, your life is worth some standard amount, all that stuff, or that you should think about the price to the system, well, that's why I have insurance. I mean, so this is a really complicated thing to start to get down. And this is why we've set up a system to where patients don't have to think about those
I think the
things.
very fact that we're focused so much on the patient experience and the patient enfranchisement in the system is fundamentally a sign of progress, right?
I would
And
agree.
on that attempt to leave us on a high note, I have to conclude the panel. But thank you to all of you for your thoughts and wisdom, and thank you to you for your questions.
Thank you.